Hey guys, Kevin here with MixCoach. Now, last week, I mentioned on the call or on the broadcast last week, the live broadcast, that I had talked to Ian Shepherd. Ian Shepherd is a mastering engineer from the UK. He is a guy that I go to for some mastering advice, and literally the conversation that you're about to hear is an honest to goodness call like, hey, help me understand this, Ian. And Ian is such a kind soul that he agreed to sit down with me. I learn a lot when I hear two people talking about a certain subject that I'm interested in. I have really never been that interested in mastering because I've just given it to a mastering engineer, but I am more and more interested in mastering. And Ian, he's one of those guys that makes it seem simple. It is simple, but it's not easy, as he says on his website. So Ian has a website called productionadvice.co.uk, and the links will be in the description below. Don't worry about it. Just go down to the description below. He is actually launching a mastering course later this week. The links for that mastering class will be in the description also, and also in the video. And I am seriously thinking about going through the mastering class myself because I did learn so much from Ian, and I think there's so much more I could learn from Ian. So I want to apologize in advance that we did this conversation via Zoom, and his internet was kind of wonky a little bit, and you'll see him lock up a little bit. You never lose audio, which is important, but you will see his video lock up from time to time. But you shouldn't have any trouble listening to this. So without any further hesitation, enjoy this conversation that I had with Ian Shepherd. Thanks for coming today. I appreciate you taking time. I know it's not quite as early there as it is here, but I know you're a busy guy, and I really, really am grateful that I have somebody that I can trust to kind of explain this stuff to me. So, okay, so let's jump right in. I get asked a question all the time. What is mastering? And although it's easy to explain the difference for me to explain to somebody who doesn't know, the details like we do, the difference between mixing and mastering, it is hard to tell them sometimes what the role of a mastering engineer is because it has changed over time, at least in my opinion. So tell me, mastering, with you being a mastering engineer, what is mastering? What is the kind of the loose definition for mastering for you?
So I have three answers to this. There's kind of the simple one, there's the more complicated one, and then there's the boring one. So the simple one is that mastering is just making the music sound the best that it can be. And, that could involve doing very little, or it could involve doing all kinds of stuff, depending on what the material is. And it's just our job is to, have empathy and understanding for what the artist and the engineer is trying to achieve, and try and get it closer to that, I would say. The slightly longer version is to say that you could think of mastering as being like Photoshop for audio. So if you take a photograph and you decide, I don't know, you want to put it in a photo book or frame it and put it up on the wall or give it to somebody as a gift, you might look at it and go, well, actually, the color balance isn't quite right, so I want to tweak that. And, there's somebody in the background making a stupid face, so I want to try and get them out, and I'm going to crop it so that the aspect ratio looks better. With mastering is the same thing for audio, basically, except that instead of color balance, you're changing maybe EQ and dynamics. Instead of kind of taking some idiot out of the background, you're probably taking out maybe a click or a thump or some hum or buzz or some other kind of fault maybe. And rather than changing the aspect ratio, it's a question of like, well, how loud should it be in comparison to everything else? Is it super dynamic, or is it going to be much more dense and intense? What am I going for? And then the boring answer is just that it's literally kind of making it the best, or optimizing it for the destination format. So back in the day, that would have meant, vinyl cutting. So making sure that the needle doesn't jump out of the groove. Then we moved on to, you had cassette, and then you had CD, where actually there are kind of far fewer technical restrictions of the format other than the maximum level that you can put on there, just because it's so high quality. And these days you have streaming services where the audio is going to be data compressed. It's going to they're going to reduce the file size to get it to stream better to computers and phones and all the rest of it, and that could have some influences on the way that it works. So you kind of combine all of those three things together. I mean, I think the other thing that I would say is, for me, one of the most valuable things about having a mastering engineer is just it's somebody you trust with a ton of experience, who's spent as much time as more time than is sensible making their playback system as accurate as possible, and understanding how things are going to sound and how they're going to translate to the widest variety of playback systems. So it's going to sound, the way people expect on a phone or a smart speaker or a PA or a home stereo system, whatever it might be. Does that help?
Oh, absolutely. I've had fantastic experience with mastering engineers. I have taught people that have asked me, find someone that you trust their ear, they will tell you the truth and not just tell you what you want to hear. They will improve you, because I've always said iron sharpens iron. And if you find somebody that you trust their ear, you like what they do, they're going to improve you as a mixing engineer. First of all. And I've also, on the other hand, had the mastering engineer that was the frustrated mixing engineer that wasn't getting enough work, who bought a really nice set of speakers and maybe a really cool compressor, and completely tried to change the mix without a lot of control. I had, one or two levers that tried to turn the snare up and turn the vocal down, that sort of thing. So I've had the experience on both ends. So I 100% agree with you that having a mastering engineer is less about you've heard they're good or whatever, and more about, hey, because one of the things I always ask my mastering engineer is like, hey, what can I do to make your job a little easier next time? That's where the gold is for me, because they'll say, hey, I had to carve out a little 200 and everything. So you might want to take a listen to your speakers and make sure that your room's not blah, blah, blah. I've actually had that happen before. So that is gold. That's a great answer. And I love the, best for the format. I think that's what I've tried to explain, but not as succinctly as you just did. So basically, sound better, Photoshop. I haven't made that analogy yet, but that's brilliant. Okay, so as far as best for the format, back in the day, you had to compress the low end to keep the needle from skipping. And I've talked to old school mastering engineers that actually did this. They said they would DS everything to make everything sound a little warmer, which is a trick that I took and, tried to make it benefit me when it came to things sounding a little more analog. But now it seems like it's not, that the format that we're going with can pretty much take, pretty much all frequency ranges and pretty much all dynamic ranges. But now, with Spotify and some of the popular, streaming formats, there are penalties now when it comes to how, I don't know if it's sheer volume. And this is what I'd love for you to explain to me personally. Is it sheer volume that they're penalizing for? Is it dynamic range that they're penalizing for? Tell me, even though I know what LUFS is, loudness units, full scale. And I've seen several readouts, and I've actually got a song that I've put into a couple of things. One of them is loudness penalty, which I think you had a lot to do with, if not everything to do with. I don't know, but and I've gotten two different readouts, and I'd love for you to explain. So let's start here. First of all, LUFS, Spotify, all that stuff. Are they penalizing for sheer loudness, or are they penalizing for dynamic range?
So I think the first thing I should say is you're absolutely right. I helped develop the loudness penalty website with Ian Kerr from Meter Plugs, and it was so popular that we ended up releasing a plugin of it. We deliberately chose the name loudness penalty because we wanted to catch people's attention. The reality is, it's not necessarily a penalty. We can talk more about what I mean, but basically all it's saying is, if you make the stuff too loud, they will turn it down. But that's not because they don't want you to make loud music. It's because the number one source of complaints from radio, TV, streaming services, wherever, is sudden changes in loudness. You know, I mean, everybody's had it. You're listening on shuffle and you get something from the 80s that's playing kind of quietly, so you turn it up, and then something from the late 90s comes on and it just blasts out at you. Everybody hates that. Or just the opposite. You know, you've been listening happily and then something comes on and suddenly you can't hear it anymore and you have to crank the level up. So the streaming services know that. You know, broadcast, TV and radio, they require you to supply things at a certain loudness to fit their specification. Streaming services have gone with a different approach, which is called normalization, which is, it's the process of making things more normal, which in terms of loudness just means making them more consistent. They are starting to standardize in the way that they're doing it, but they all still have slightly different things about them. But basically what they do is they try and assess how loud the music is that you submit to them. And if it's going to be much, much louder than anything else, they will turn it down so that it's not. And that's the penalty. Except if the music still sounds great when that happens, it's not a penalty at all. You don't have to worry. Now, I'm a big fan of dynamics in music. So, you know, I'm quite comfortable with seeing the loudest stuff that I master being turned down by 2 or 3 dBs by the streaming services. You know, that's not a big deal to me. If I see 4, 5, 6 dBs or more of reduction in level, I'm always thinking, well, have I missed a trick? Could I actually get more out of this by not pushing it as hard on the way in so that there's more room for the dynamic stuff? And I love to do that experiment. And whenever I do, I pretty much always find that I prefer the version with more dynamics that's being turned down less. So that's where I do feel that it is genuinely a penalty. You know, I've caught a fair bit of flack from people, from other mastering engineers going, don't tell people it's a penalty. It's just an adjustment, right? It's just an offset that they put in. And I always say, well, A, the name was meant to make people think, and it has, so I'm comfortable with that. And B, if it's being turned way down, I genuinely do think it is a penalty, because once you get past a certain point in terms of loudness, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You have to start compromising. You know, you have to start compressing and limiting to achieve that higher loudness. And for me, that compromises what you're able to achieve in terms of the music, the way that it sounds and the way that it feels. So you're kind of giving yourself a penalty in the sense, you know, you're shooting yourself in the foot by pushing it really hard on the way in, and then it only gets turned down. So that's my little bit about why we called it a penalty, and whether, you know, it's not really. I think I'm all about finding the sweet spot, the perfect balance between the two. So it's all about loudness, and they measure it using loudness units full scale, which is LUFS, which is it's become an international standard. It was developed in the US to regulate the level of ads on TV, and it's not perfect, but it is pretty good, and it's the best that we have at the moment. You know, there's lots of stuff that plays into how loud something sounds and how loud it feels, so it's a real challenge. And yeah, LUFS isn't perfect, but it's pretty good. And so basically what's happening is they are measuring using LUFS or some other metric, and then kind of saying, okay, well, you're 3 dBs louder than our distribution loudness, the loudness that we want to play things out at. So we're going to turn it down so that it's not way, way louder than anything else. You asked about dynamics. The one thing that can happen is if you go the other way and you upload something super quiet, not all the services will turn it up. YouTube won't turn it up at all. So one thing that you find with YouTube is that if somebody, like quite often when people upload TV programs, the broadcast level is down at -23, right? And YouTube, Spotify and Tidal, their current distribution loudness is -14. I've literally just been working with the AES on a new set of guidelines, and the AES recommends -16 overall for music. So that might come down a bit in future. That's kind of by the by. You know, it doesn't really matter what the level is, because we can always turn it up on the device. But the lower the level is, the reference level, the distribution loudness, the more flexibility you've got to effectively normalize everything else. Because if you imagine something at -23 and YouTube doesn't turn it up, so you hear something at -14, something loud, and then you hear something at minus 23, that's almost 10 dBs difference. So it's still going to sound way louder. Tidal doesn't turn anything up either. Spotify do turn things up, but only so far as to not cause clipping. So say the thing at minus 23 had peaks at minus 6. They can turn it up by, they keep the peaks at minus 1 for safety, so they can turn it up by 5 dBs. So it will get somewhat louder, but it's still going to be 5 dBs lower than the thing that was at minus 14. So I know this is all hard to do with the numbers. If this is minus 14, if this is the distribution loudness, you're listening to something at minus 14, but then somebody's uploaded something at minus 23. It's way down here. Spotify will try, YouTube won't turn it up at all. Neither will Tidal. Spotify will try and turn it up, but at this point, once it's gone up by 5 dBs, that's the point where it would cause clipping distortion, and they want to avoid that. So then they stop. So you're not 10 dBs down, but you're still 5 dBs down. So if you like, you could interpret that as a penalty for having your stuff be too dynamic. But in my experience, that's not a big issue, because the majority, actually, Elko Grimm did some research for Tidal on this. They analysed 4.2 million albums in the Tidal catalogue, and they found that 80% of them, the loudest song is at minus 14 or louder already. Okay, so that means that they can turn stuff that's louder down. That's fine, but almost all the stuff is going to be loud enough already. And in fact, when you're mastering, I said it's all about balancing the EQ and the loudness and all the rest of it. You don't want to make everything the same loudness, right? As a mastering engineer, I don't make everything minus 14 or minus 16 or minus 23 or anything else. I say, okay, here's the loudest song. This is the way that I want to sound. And then everything else is balanced musically to that. I pay attention to the numbers just to kind of, make sure my ears aren't deceiving me. But it's basically an artistic decision, what's right for the music. So you don't want an acoustic ballad, guitar and vocals to be as loud as a death metal song. That just doesn't make artistic sense. Right. And okay, that's a slightly extreme example, but you could easily have an indie pop rock album where you've got a kind of full-on thrashy guitar thing that wants to be really loud, and then something much more gentle to balance with it. So when you think about that, you don't really want those quiet songs turned up, because it'll mess up that artistic decision. So it doesn't matter in that sense that you've got this quieter, more dynamic thing and it's not going to get turned up, because that's exactly what you wanted artistically. And in fact, Spotify and iTunes and Tidal all have what's called album normalization, where basically what they do is they just turn the whole album up or down to keep that musical relationship between the songs. And the new guidelines that I mentioned, I think that's the best method. Tidal use album normalization all the time, even when you listen in shuffle. So if you shuffle a loud song with a quiet song, the quiet song will still sound musically appropriately quiet. Whereas if you're in shuffle on Spotify, it'll actually crank the quiet stuff up as far as it can. And that can kind of mess with those, the decisions that we make as engineers and artists. So, I've been talking quite a long time. I'll pause and see whether that's helpful.
No, that's very helpful. I learned a ton, knowing that that Spotify will turn things up and YouTube definitely does not. That definitely is insightful. So my my question is, I usually mix it like before I got into LUFS, when I thought it was just too complicated for me to learn. I felt like I had an epiphany a few years ago from a mastering engineer that it was RMS and peak level, and the difference between those two. I think it's a Bobcats thing, and I think it's called K14. So I started teaching my guys, hey, if you mix within this 14 dB range from peak to RMS or average, then mastering engineers won't hate you. And if you don't get it mastered, you're not going to get eye rolls from people, because it's in that sweet spot. Would you agree with that? 14 dB is kind of a sweet spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny because lots of people don't like normalization. I think normalization is a good thing, right? Because it gives me more freedom to master the way that it wants. Before we had normalization, back in CD, you had the loudness wars. So other people could make their stuff louder than what I was doing. And otherwise, it wouldn't sound any better at all. It was just louder on the CD. And when people compared those things, they would think that it sounded louder, that it would sound better because it was louder. And before you had normalization online, the same thing would happen. And that just obviously creates this kind of this feeling, well, I must make my stuff loud or it's not going to sound as good as anything else. With normalization, I know that if something is super loud, it's going to be reduced. So I don't have to make my stuff super loud unless I want to. You know, sometimes the material might justify it. But I want to do what's musically best. And normalization lets me relax and know that I can do that. So that's all good. Remind me what your question was.
Okay, so here's one thing. We've in the past talked about the Julian meter, and there are there's a box in there, and maybe the next logical thing for us to do is to take a look at my song in these two different formats. But one of the boxes has basically it's an average dynamic range. So, and I've heard people say that 8 dB dynamic range is like where the sweet spot is. It kind of sounds mastering. From what I just told you, it would be 14 dB would be the dynamic range. So can you clear that up for me?
Right. So yeah, you were asking whether 14 is right. So normalization is good because you can choose. What I tend to do is I don't aim for an overall loudness, because you don't want everything to be the same, right? You don't want your ballads to be the same as the full-on rock tunes or an EDM track or whatever. What I tend to do is pay attention to the loudest moments of the song. And my rule of thumb for anybody who's interested is to not let the loudest moments get above -10 LUFS. They can generally. And I also keep my peaks, my true peaks, at -1 LUFS, partly because that's recommended by iTunes and Spotify and a few other streaming services. Also because I know that it will help prevent any problems when the stuff gets converted to MP3 or AAC or all of those data compression codecs that we talked about. So if we think about what you were talking about there, between the difference between the peak level and the loudness, if you've got -1 up here and no louder than -10 down here, that's about 9 dBs peak to loudness ratio. You were saying about the peak to RMS. LUFS is basically an update of RMS loudness. It's a kind of more intelligent version of RMS. So it's basically the same thing. And actually the peak to loudness ratio, the PLR, is a thing. That's one way to talk about a piece of audio. So basically, yes, I completely agree with you. I would say a loudness difference of 8 between the peaks and the loudness is actually probably getting a bit low. And in fact, one of the plugins I made with MeterPlugs is called Dynameter, and it displays exactly this. It displays the short-term peak to loudness, so not for the whole song, but you can just see the graph of it evolve over time. And 8 is the point where we start coloring the graph in red, because that's, I think, and that's because I personally grew up getting the needles to tickle the red, so I wanted the same thing to be true in Dynameter. So if the loudest sections are at least sort of 8-9 dB peak to loudness difference, which is about -10 short-term LUFS, but then maybe it's a varied song, or that there's one song that's up there for the whole way through, and then there's another one that's got more variety and is gentler and is lower level. When you work in that way, and that's your rule of thumb, and then you go for the musical approach that I mentioned, just kind of, okay, here's my loudest point, I'm going to get everything else to feel right in comparison to that. What tends to happen is my loudest songs are probably mastered about -11, maybe -10 LUFS. Quieter ones can be -14. Stuff that's quite varied is often -12. Some stuff that's really gentle might be down at -16. So basically, yes, somewhere around that -12 to -16, so kind of -14 in the middle, I think is a good kind of average place to sit. Doesn't mean I think anybody should aim at it. But I think the thing that I keep saying to people is, if you master it to -14 and it sounds good to you, you're great. Stop worrying, because not much is going to happen to it online. They're not going to touch the level much, if at all. Anything else is going to get turned down to -14 So in comparison, you should be fine. And I do think that's what I was going to say at an earlier point, and I lost my thread. The interesting thing is that when you go back and look at some of the classic albums through history and that tidal research, most stuff is in that kind of -12, -14, -16 area in terms of the loudness, the difference, or the same kind of difference between the peak and loudness. So the numbers that the streaming services are currently using are pretty sensible in terms of what you want to do musically. And oddly enough, they also tie in really well with what we always used to do in terms of vinyl. That whole thing about, in theory, you don't have to control the music and the bass levels and all the rest of it in the way that we did with vinyl. It's not like you're actually going to burn out the cutting head or have the needle jump out of the groove anymore. But I would say to people, master as if it was going to vinyl. If you imagine your album is going to be released on vinyl and make it sound good, you'll end up with something that sounds great and that works on all these different platforms really effectively. So, it's kind of a nice rule of thumb. So yeah, short version. Yes, I think those, -14 is, I would say, kind of in the middle of the range. It's okay to go a bit louder if you want to. But be aware. I think that the really key thing that I want to say to people is to make the comparison, is to make the check. So for example, we made the loudness penalty site where you can, it's free. You can just drag an audio file into your browser. It doesn't get uploaded. All the calculations are done on your computer, so it's completely secure. And it will tell you within a few seconds, not too long, what is going to happen in terms of the loudness of that song on all the popular streaming platforms. So, if you upload something at -14, it's going to give you values of 0 for most of them because you're at the distribution loudness level. They don't need to make any changes. If you master it louder, -10, say, it's going to turn it down by 4 dBs because otherwise it would be 4 dBs louder and it would annoy people, right? That's why the streaming services do that. Right. So it will tell you those numbers, and they vary a little bit between services, and it can kind of be interesting to dig into the details of that. But the key thing is not so much what the numbers are, is once you've got the file in there and you can see those numbers, click the preview button, right? And it will then play it to you at -14, and providing the volume, you've got equal volume between the browser, and you could open another tab in YouTube, right? Say you wanted to, Foo Fighters was your reference material. Find your favorite Foo Fighters song, play it on YouTube, and then pause it, flick back to loudness penalty, click preview, and you're going to hear it at the level that it will be if you upload it to YouTube. And that's when you want to do your comparison, right? If you play back, let's say you mastered it at -10, so it's 4 dBs louder than YouTube. If you play your song from your DAW, from Logic or Cubase or whatever, and then you play YouTube, the YouTube version or the YouTube Foo Fighters song is going to have been turned down by 4 dBs. It's going to be at -14. So yours is going to sound amazing because it's 4 dBs louder. But then when you upload it and it gets turned down, you're going to be disappointed, or you might be disappointed in comparison. So the key thing is to use the preview button. You don't have to use loudness penalty. You could use a loudness meter and just measure the loudness of the song and make the adjustments yourself. But it's kind of super convenient to have it there. So you compare the preview with YouTube or wherever and think, am I happy with the way that sounds? And if the answer is yes, then you're good to go. And if the answer is no, then you can start to think about, well, maybe I need to tweak something to, did I make it too loud? Did I not make it loud enough? And you can play around and try some different versions to get a result you like.
Right. So I pulled up the loudness penalty plugin because you were talking about. So what I've done is I've taken a same song that I've mixed, and I've uploaded it to Julian, which is what I kind of use to get my levels, I guess, and to see if I was going to be penalized. And then I just put it in the loudness penalty, and I'm seeing that YouTube is going to pull my mix down 3 dB, Spotify, Tidal, and you mentioned in the preview that's pretty brilliant. Go listen to a song on YouTube, play it there, and then listen to yours, and it's the same level. That's gold right there for me. So What do you see when you see this? That I just need to pull my mix down by 3
No,
dB? Do I have 3 dB to? I mean, what do you see in there?
I'm completely comfortable with that. If that song is intended to be loud, musically,
Mm-hmm.
then -3, I'm happy with that. That means that your song is mastered at -11, so they pulled it down by 3 dBs to -14. I'm completely comfortable with that. In terms of numbers, what I would say is you need to click that preview button and then flick over to a YouTube tab and listen to something similar musically on YouTube and make sure that you're happy with the way they sound next to each other.
Okay.
And if you are, then as I say, it's all good. Now, if your numbers there said -7 or -8, then I would be kind of thinking, well, that's a lot, that means it's being turned down by 6 or 7 dBs. If I backed off the level of my mix, say I'm using a limiter or a saturator or something to get the level up at the end of it, I would want to do the experiment. So I would go back into the mix, I'd pull back the levels of the mix, the master fader before the limiter, so that the mix is 3 or 4 dBs quieter. And then I would open up another loudness penalty tab there and bring that new quieter mix in and preview that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you would see a smaller penalty. Let's say the other one was getting -7, yeah? You'd see -7 for the loud one. You'd see -3 for this one. When you preview them, they're going to sound the same loudness because that's the whole point.
Right.
The goal for the streaming service is to make things consistent. But the one that you've got there that's at -3 was pushed less hard than the one that is at -7. So you can listen and see how they sound. And you might find that the -7 one, maybe there's adding some distortion that you like, or maybe it's adding some extra intensity that you like. Again, if you're happy with the way that it sounds, doesn't matter what the number says, you want to go with that. But for me, almost always, I find that once you start getting past -3, it's the law of diminishing returns. That's where you start getting into those compromises that we talked about earlier, where you're having to use more and more limiting, more and more compression. And unless it's, a really intense, aggressive genre, probably it's not making it sound any better. It's just making it sound louder.
Okay.
And so then that's when I would do the experiment and see whether I can get a result that I'm happy with.
So just so I'm clear, you're saying that 3 dB normal, you'd be happy with that. When you start getting to 4, 5, 6 dB, you should experiment. No penalty
In
for
my
going the
opinion.
other way. I'm sorry.
In my opinion, sorry.
Okay, but if it's not bringing it down like 1 or 2 dB, then it's even better, right? Or
Well, it's also fine, right? Because
okay,
I mean, if you think about it, if you see a score there of 0, it means that the streaming service is not changing the loudness at all. So exactly what you put in is exactly what you get out, and that's why people aim at -14.
mm-hmm.
The bit that I'm concerned about with that is that you shouldn't be aiming for numbers. You should be aiming for the sound. And sometimes things don't sound right at -14. They would sound better at -12 or -11 or whatever, or at -16 or -17, right? So, yeah. I mean, the other thing that you might sometimes see there is a plus. You would only typically see that with Spotify, right? Because YouTube and Tidal are not turning things up. But if you see a plus there, it means that actually your song was quieter than the distribution loudness when you uploaded it. So they're going to turn it up. And that's also fine, providing you're happy with the way that it sounds. It's just something interesting to be aware of. It used to be the case that Spotify might have added a limiter to do that, but they've changed it now. They don't use a limiter anymore from the beginning of this year onwards. So you're not going to get any extra limiting, none of the extra services. Okay, so to be really detailed, there is one case where they will, which is that if you're a subscriber to Spotify and you go into the preferences, you can change the default setting, which is -14, to what they call the loud setting, which is intended for people listening in noisy environments. If you're struggling to get enough gain out of your device, in that case they increase their distribution loudness level to -11, And to achieve that, in order to turn up the quiet stuff, they will then use a limiter. But I haven't got this kind of an official quote, but I've been told that only 17% of users change those settings at all. So that means that 87% of Spotify users are using on the default settings, where you won't get any limiting. You don't need to worry about it. So
Okay.
so yeah, 0, -1, -2, -3, I'm completely comfortable with. Past -3, I start to feel like, oh, maybe I'm missing a trick, you know?
Okay.
I mean, the other thing is, I would say, if it's intended to be a gentle song and it's scoring -3, maybe it's louder than it needed to be to begin with. You know, it all depends what the material is and how it sounds when you preview it. Now, having said that, there's a load of commercial releases, if you just rip stuff off of a CD or download the files and put them in, where you will see scores of -6, -7, -8. And they probably sound fine. They probably sound good. I mean, it's tricky, right? Because we never know what they might have sounded like if they were a little less loud in the first place. But a lot of major label releases are going to be really, really loud. And you might want to use that as your reference. So you might choose to aim for those, you know, more for that. I've seen people saying, oh no, you need to be scoring a -6 on loudness penalty, -7 to get the sound right. I don't believe that. That's not my experience. But this is where, you know, kind of taste and experience and all the rest of it comes in. I agree with you. You know, you found that following those guidelines of, you know, around about -14 has been getting you great results. I'm finding that as well. And I would encourage other people listening to this to go for that as well, just because it's really hard to make, you know, the louder you want to make it, the harder it is to get those results without causing damage. And if it's not actually going to get you anything, you know, in this day and age when most people listen to stuff online, if you're going to hear it first on YouTube, what's the point of making it super loud and having it turned down? You know, why not just have it sound better, make your life easier, and have it not turned down as much? So,
Right.
you know, it's
Right. Okay.
we wonder, in Dynameter, we deliberately color coded the meter because it made it kind of easier to get a handle on, and it was kind of aimed for people who want to have great dynamics in their music. So we've had people complain about the color coding, and that we talked about color coding loudest penalty as well, and we decided not to. And you know, we've had enough flack from the name, having the word penalty in the name, without kind of color coding as well. But if I was going to color code it, for me, you know, -3 would kind of be orange, and beyond -3 would be red for kind of, oh, careful.
Okay. So you've mentioned Dynameter and loudness penalty is now available as a plugin. Is that a different plugin?
Yes. So there's two different plugins there. So Dynameter shows you this pretty kind of colorful graph, and it's an alternative to, I find the LUFS meters, the bars and all the rest of it, hard to read. I like to use an old style VU meter as a software emulation of it, you know, but a needle meter. But Dynameter is another way to just display that information. The loudness penalty plugin, we were never going to make it. You know, we came up with this idea. We put the site up there for free because we felt it was a valuable resource for the community. You know, a lot of mastering engineers were saying to me, I find it so hard to explain to people. You know, they're saying to me, can you make this louder? And I'm saying, yes, but it's not going to sound as good, and it's going to get turned down anyway. And they seem not to believe me. So that was the motivation behind doing the site, was to have a way for people to easily see what the real world effect of what they were doing was going to be, and to decide what they wanted to do. So it was a free site, and we had it was up for over a year, but we just kept having people saying, please, can you do this as a plugin for the DAW? So in the end, we did. And it basically gives you exactly the same thing. So with the website, you drab the file on, it calculates the numbers and tells you the answer. The plugin runs in real time. So if you want to know the correct value for a song, you have to play it all the way through. So in some ways that's less convenient because it's slower. But the cool and the interesting thing about it is you can watch how the number changes over time. So it might start with a quiet introduction and it's kind of saying, oh, you know, there's going to be no change. It's a 0. And then you get to the loud bit and suddenly drops right down to -4. That tells you, okay, that's the section that is causing this big adjustment to happen. And that can be helpful, if you're finding something is being turned down more than you expect and it doesn't sound the way that you hope. It can be useful to use the plugin to zero in. There's a couple of other things. You can hover over one of the. So if the meter shows you 2 dashes, it means that the level's not going to be changed at all, which usually means that it's quieter than the distribution loudness, right? So if you're going on YouTube where the reference is -14 and you upload something at -16, they don't turn it up, so you get 2 dashes. So 2 dashes doesn't mean perfect, it means just no change. With the plugin, what you can do is you can hover over that and it'll actually tell you, oh, if you want to, you can make this 2 or 3 dBs louder without causing any kind of change. This is when you're going to start seeing the negative numbers come in. So that's just kind of one of those little extra things that we could do with the plugin. But basically, there's no I use the website. I mean, I have the plugin obviously because we made it and it's kind of sitting there in my, so every so often I'll kind of glance at it. But you didn't ask me this, but I'd like to say I don't master using numbers. I have my monitoring set up at a calibrated level. It's always the same loudness. So if I drag something into my DAW and play it, I can hear immediately whether it's mastered loud or whether it's mastered quiet. What it also means is that because I never change that level, I've learned over time exactly how things should sound to me. It's a super simple thing that anybody can do if they're interested in mastering, is to just pick the loudness level that sounds good to them when they're working on their reference tracks. And yeah, over time you learn, you just get an instinct, all this theory and all the rest of it. You just make it sound good when your monitoring is at that level. It's the first thing I teach on the mastering course that I do, and it's really, really effective. So yeah, I bring in a song. Usually they're a bit quiet. I push the level up. That's the first thing I do. No other changes. I have a limiter in there just to prevent any clipping. And then I listen to it, and then I kind of go, okay, so let's try a little bit of EQ. Oh, maybe we need some compression, all the rest of it. And I keep it. Then I might glance at the loudness meter or the VU meter or at dynameter. And if I see something unexpected, if it's, oh, that's louder than I thought it was going to be, or that looks a bit low, then I might kind of think again. But usually I look at the meters and go, yeah, that's good. And then I might export it, and then out of interest, I might drag it onto the loudness penalty site and go, oh, -2, -3, okay, cool. It's not like I'm sitting there going, okay, I need to tweak it up to. It's interesting because you mentioned that you've been playing with a new limiter, the TC Electronic Brick Wall, which is a software version of something that I used for years as a professional mastering engineer. It's a really good, clean digital limiter, and the plugin version has this new thing where you can say, I want the music to be -14, -16, whatever, and it will adjust the levels to do that and just give you just as much limiting as you need. I can understand why that's a cool feature and why people might want that, but that's not the way that I work, right? Because I'm not going to listen to a song and go, oh, this should be -12 or -14 or whatever.
Right.
You listen to the song and you make I have the limiter there and I adjust the loudness going into it. And then afterwards I might look at the numbers. But as I say, aiming at it's kind of, I think one of the downsides of normalization is, it feels logical, right? You say, okay, YouTube are going to play this at -14, so I should master it at -14.
Right. You don't want to leave any money on the table, right?
Exactly.
Loudness-wise, yeah.
It makes sense if you can get it to sound good at -14. If you're happy with, you are saying that you can, and that's great. That my loud stuff tends to be more like -12. It's all good. The problem is when people think, oh, it must be -14, and they aim at it and they're not getting the results that they expect, and then they get frustrated because they're like, well, they said it should be -14 and it doesn't sound right, and and that's because you're not aiming at numbers. The numbers are interesting. The numbers are valuable in terms of understanding what's going to happen. If you have a -2 loudness penalty, it's going to get turned down by 2 dBs, and that's how you need to compare it. Right. That's useful and helpful, but it still doesn't mean you should aim at the numbers. So yeah, Again, you didn't ask that, but it's kind of a really common thing that I see, or people kind of going, oh, I mastered it to minus 14 and I uploaded it to Spotify and it doesn't sound the way that I expected. And it's like, well, okay, there's 2 bits to it. Bear the minus 14 in mind, but also do the preview. You could do it in your DAW. You could run it through. The loudness meter says it's minus 10, so okay, I need to turn that down by minus 14 and then make my comparison with whatever's on YouTube. Or if you bring your reference tracks in, turn them down to minus 14 first, because that's how most people are going to hear them. And then when you compare your mix or your master with them, you'll find you don't have to push it as hard necessarily, or maybe you find you do have to push it harder in order to get it right, and then you need to know that it's going to be turned down. So it's right. It's frustrating, right? Because it's quite simple, but it's also quite complicated. So I'll stop. Ask me a question. What have I not explained clearly?
No, this is great. And, this is the second time another mastering engineer, as a matter of fact, John Mayfield, the guy that I learned, he was the guy who told me after I'd mixed this record, and this hasn't been that long ago, probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. I mastered a record, and he's one of these guys, and I'm telling you, finding a good mastering engineer is very valuable. He said, you hear your snare drums on this song? I'm like, yeah. He said, I'm not gonna have to do anything to this. And he pulled up another song and he said, you hear the snare drum on this one? I said, yeah. He said, I've either got to clip your snare drum or compress it. I'm going to have to change your mix to make this to make this sound like the other song. And that's when I realized that, wow, and then I started retracing my steps through my 30 plus years of mixing. When I first started on analog, when we mixed to an analog tape machine, it didn't matter what the peaks were. I just had to get the average level up. I let the tape machine basically be my limiter, my compressor, and I got my average up, and I was listening to the output of it. So I would make determinations then on whether I was messing up my mix or not. And when I listened back to some of those old mixes, which fell between the 14, dB range, the 14 minus 14 LUFS, they still stand up dynamic wise. It's only until the peak meter became the primary source for everybody to determine their level with that music started to kind of fall apart glue wise to me. And that's when everybody started reaching for the old analog sound. And I think this is kind of the reason is that dynamic range that happened. But anyway, I learned that from John Mayfield, and you just verified it for me. He said the best thing you can do to make your mixes consistent is listen at the same level. And he said, and I don't think he even had a volume knob in his control room. He had no level knob that he could turn things up. He had a dim and he had a mute, but he had no level. And he said, I listen to the mixes the same way. And when you think about driving a car and how much you learn muscle memory as far as like, where to look to see if you'll run over anything, go to reverse. You don't even think about it anymore. It's like, oh, how'd this seatbelt get on me? Because I wasn't even thinking about it. You start to train your muscle memory to not listen at a loud level and then a low level. And then you're always having to think about how you're doing it, listening at the same level all the time. I don't know how practical that is for me when you have, honestly, is it practical in your opinion? I mean, I know you've done it. Is it practical to listen at the same level all the time?
I do it for mastering, and I was trained to do it 25 years ago, and at the time I didn't really understand the point of it, and now I do. Mm-hmm. I think it's practical for mixing, but you're going to have to you're going to have different levels for mixing and for mastering, because it depends how you work. Some people have mastering processing on the mix bus, and they're trying to get a mastered sound when they mix. I don't like that, and I don't advise that. I actually think there's a lot of value in having the mixing process and the mastering process separate. Okay. You right at the top, you asked me the difference between mixing and mastering, and I would say there's the 3 M's of mastering. There's monitoring, meters, and mindset. And mindset is actually the real key thing. I mean, because when you think about it, this is something that I got from a talk I went to with William Orbit. He was saying that he likes to think of mixing and production as like you're constantly zooming in and out. You're 1 minute you're focusing on the kick drum sound and whether there's enough click and whether there's enough thump and how it balances with the bass, and then you're zooming right out and going, does the song make me want to dance or laugh or cry or whatever that might be? So it's this constant process, and I completely agree with him about that. Mastering is taking another step back again and kind of saying, how does this work in the context of the album? And for me, that's when my head starts to explode. There's another analogy for you in terms of, if mixing is balancing the channels within a mix to make a song, mastering is like balancing the tracks on an album or the songs on an album to make an album. And for me, I mean, because one of the things is when you're mixing, you've got to start somewhere, right? So you're on song 1. You've got no idea how that's going to relate to the mix you're eventually going to end up with for track 12. I mean, these days it's easier because you can recall and switch between them. So that helps. Back when we both started, you were literally recalling the mix on the desk and it would be a whole new thing to tape and all the rest of it. But yeah, I think there's a real, it's too much to try and get it all done at the mix stage. And B, there's a real value in taking a step back. You've got reduce your options. You've just got this stereo file. You put 10 stereo songs or 3 or whatever it is that you're working on. And you're kind of thinking, okay, how does the loudness of those relate to each other? How does the tonal balance relate? What should the gaps be? All that stuff. Ideally take a bit of time, so you do the mixing, get away from, if you're doing your own mastering, that's another value of having a mastering engineer is it's not you. Somebody else comes to it who just kind of doesn't know any of the stuff, doesn't know the history or the reasons why the songs sound the way they do. He's just like, that's a bit too boomy in the bass or whatever.
Right.
But so if you're going to do the mixing and the mastering separately, as I suggest, it makes sense to me to not push it too hard in the mixing. So relax, give yourself a bit more, I think when you're mixing LUFS levels, more like -16, -18, so you've got plenty of peak headroom, because then you can mix for the sound. You don't have to worry about the peaks like you were saying back about in the analog days, I mean, maybe you have a limiter right at the end just for safety to stop clipping, but you're probably never going to hit it with, if you're down at -18 LUFS, the peaks are unlikely to get close to 0. And then when you get to the mastering stage, okay, you're going to turn it up by 2 or 3 or 4 dBs, but you might want to use a compressor to get a bit of glue in there that can help. You've got the limiter to prevent the peaks, and it gives you the flexibility. You can say, okay, I can push this up and know that it's not going to go over the top. That means that so for me, when I'm mastering, if I have my mastering level and I'm tuned into that, when I'm mixing, if I want to mix quieter, I still want to hear the music good and loud. So that's the time when I do adjust the monitoring gain. So I said I only listen ever at one loudness level. It's not strictly true because I have a dim level as well, which is -12. So there's mastering level, -12. And then for mixing, I mean, it depends on the material. I tend to adjust it by ear, but it's going to be 4, 5, 6 dBs louder so that I'm still hearing the music loud without having to push it up into a limiter to get there. And I think if you do that, I don't adjust the gain within a mixing project. I mean, I guess I might if I had a completely, if literally it was an acoustic ballad and all the levels were way down. But you can always push the master fader up. And I guess the less you move the volume control, there's a favorite saying of mine, I didn't make this up, but which is, a man with a watch can tell you what the time is, but a man with 2 is never sure. Right, and it's the same thing for the car check and the earbud check and all the rest of it. On the one hand, it can be valuable to listen on lots of different monitoring systems. On the other hand, if you listen to too many, you're kind of like, well, which one is right? You don't know where you're going. So I always suggest to people, get the monitoring in a studio as good as you can, and maybe have 1 or 2 other places where you listen, but don't go over the top. And I'd say the same with loudness levels. The more you change that, every time you change the monitor gain, you change the way that it sounds, because you turn something up, it feels like it's got more bass and more treble. You go in, you change all the EQ, then you turn it back down again, and suddenly it sounds like it's got less bass and less treble. If you can keep the monitoring gain constant and stick with that, as you suggested, it's just helpful. It's so I'd say it's almost essential in I mean, there are mastering engineers who tweak the gain as well. Everybody's different, but I find it's a very consistent. Most mastering engineers have the level that they listen at.
Right.
And I think, yeah, it's a really powerful technique.
Man, I have learned so much. Look at this. I've got a page of notes here. I wanted to get one more thing. I know we need to wrap up here, but you mentioned you have a mastering course. What's the link for the mastering course?
It's homemastering.com.
Home. Okay, got it. And then the meterplugs.com, is that that's which one is
That's where you'll
that?
find the plugins. Yep,
All of them,
meterplugs.com.
right?
Yep, there's three
Okay.
that I've worked on. There's one other that we didn't talk about, which is Perception, which is all about loudness matching. It's an automated way to match your loudness for comparisons when you're mastering, which is really helpful. But yeah, there's dynameter and loudness penalty. And the loudness penalty site is just loudnesspenalty.com if anybody wants to check that out.
Got it.
Yeah, the mastering course is an 8-week course with it's kind of a big picture thing. Every week I master a different song using different plugins, a different DAW, different genres. You know, it kind of starts simple and gets more complicated. And there's a couple of other things I do. There's an EQ course and a compression and limiting course if people are interested to check that out.
Would you recommend that for a guy who does mostly mixing, or I mean, would it be something you recommend for that, or mainly just pretty much if you want to be a mastering engineer, this is the course?
Yeah, all of my stuff is aimed at mastering engineers. I mean, I would say that there are lots of people have taken them who've said they found it helpful with the mixing and recording even, because kind of understanding the mastering stage and knowing what you can and can't achieve and all of that stuff is valuable.
Okay.
But yeah, I think you want to have a good grip on recording and mixing to begin with,
Okay.
and then kind of move on to those. The other thing I'd say is I've got my YouTube channel. There's a bunch of stuff up there for free if people want to try it out. In fact, there's a series, if you go to my website, which is productionadvice.co.uk, it's another story why I have a site called Production Advice when I hardly ever talk about production and mostly about mastering. But I've pinned to the top of that, I did a series of 6 videos for Sound on Sound magazine called Mastering Essentials, where I kind of walk you through the whole thing. So a load of the stuff that we've talked about here, I talk about setting and monitoring gain and how I use compression and limiting and how I choose loudness and how to balance EQ and all that kind of stuff. So if people are interested, that would give them a really good start on the topic, I think.
Got it. Okay. So when this video is done, I'll make sure that all these links are in the comments or in the info section so that you guys can check it out. Ian, man, I have learned so much. I always learn when we chat together, and I just appreciate your time. And I'm going to go see if I can read my own handwriting here and decipher these notes. So thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. No,
it's my pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
So there you have it. Interview with Ian Shepherd. I learned so much from this call, and seriously, I still have my list of things that I jotted down. My biggest challenge is now reading that. So if you want to go through Ian's mastering course with me, you can go to mixcoach.com/Ian, IAN, mixcoach.com/Ian. Also, that link is in the description below. If you want the link to his mastering plugins, go to meterplugs.com. The link is also below this video. Hey, thanks for coming this week, and thanks for making it to this point of such a long video. It means a lot to me. If you found this share-worthy, then I would appreciate it if you shared it. If you are not a subscriber already, please hit that like and subscribe button and be notified when I go live. And I do go live from time to time. And sometimes I don't make much of an announcement beforehand, but you'll get notifications if you hit the live, if you hit the ring the bell beside the notifications button, bell. Anyway, again, glad I'm not doing this interview last week because I wouldn't be able to talk. Okay, hey, thanks for coming, and I'll talk to you next week. Okay, bye.